Welcome back. So this episode is going to be removing the steering column. So first we're going to step outside the vehicle. Again, if yours is together, you're not going to have this kind of access, but it's the same thing. You just got to hang over a fender. I've got to remove the intermediate shaft. Depends on what company you're dealing with. Some will call it the steering shaft, intermediate shaft, different names. This shaft that connects the steering column to the steering gear has to be removed at this end so the column can go out through the firewall. So I've got a 90s Jeep Cherokee, or is it Grand? It's Cherokee steering shaft in mind. So I'm just going to take this right out. So I've got to clean this up. I'll just leave that here right now. Okay, so I'm going to show you, in case you don't have this upgrade, which I recommend, and there's I think Jeep steering shaft. Some guys will use, I think it's somewhere in the 90s. Look on G-Body Forum. There's quite a bit of talk about this. Chevy Astrovan shafts. And Flaming River makes a really nice one. It's like $200 and something, I believe. It's well worth the money, I think, to replace it. Here is the General Motors steering shaft. So this end, this hole right here, pops over the return line on the steering gear, and you've got a rag joint at this end, which wears out and makes everything go floppy. And then at this end, you've got like a regular type of ball joint under there, but it's got this rubber boot on it, and those things always fail, and this thing is loose as crap too. And there's a bolt that will go through and secure this in place, and it just slides over the shaft, and that takes the place. So either way, you're going to have to get this loose. Now this one won't collapse. It's a single unit. So you're basically going to loosen it up, and then you'll pull the shaft out, and this will just remain in place. So anyway, so I don't have that, thankfully. It's junk, my opinion. So now, this is loose on this end. There will be 4 bolts inside of the vehicle that come through the firewall here that have to be taken loose, and then we'll do the rest of that from inside the car, but then the shaft will come out through the vehicle. Now, 442, it's got center console, and that's where you shift it at. But they didn't change the mechanics of how the steering shaft works. So on a regular column shift, you have your column shifter, and you shift it down through the gears, and you pop it back up. So when you're shifting it, it's moving internally inside of the steering shaft, and that's what lets the switch know that you're in either neutral or park in order to be able to activate the ignition switch. So they didn't change the steering column. All they did was this attachment over here is, I don't know if you can see it, this attachment is on, there it is, this attachment here is on the outside of the column, and there's linkage that goes down to the transmission. This is going to hang up and get in the way, so you have to disconnect that linkage if it's connected, and then take and move this down so it's inside that pocket, because this whole thing is going to come out, and that way you don't hang that up, bend it, or do something crazy. So anyway, just want to let you know, let me scoot this back down, let you know you have to do that. So now everything is disconnected out here. We'll move inside the vehicle, back underneath the dash, and get the bolts loose, and then we'll get this thing out. And there's a couple of little things you got to do. You got to drop the column from the bottom of the dash, so we'll do all that. Okay, now we're underneath the vehicle, and as you can see, the cover that goes underneath here is gone. It's a bunch of 7mm screws that hold that in place. So you can take that out, and then what you'll have is this. So this center vent here, this needs to come out. It's underneath the column. There's a couple of Phillips screws I think 4 of them that hold that in. And then it's connected to this AC venting by these two, or one of these 7mm here. Leave that in place because you can just pull that right out with it. All you have to do is disconnect this one coupler. And it has there's clips on it that, because there it is, it snaps in place. You can see there's a little ring right here. So it just snaps in place. So get that loose so it's out of the way. And then all you have to do is get a Phillips screwdriver and start taking some of those screws out, and we'll get this out here. Hold on. Okay, in the interest of saving some time, I've removed 3 of the 4 Phillips screws. So the only one left is this one, and this whole thing should just swing down and out of place. There we go. There you go. Gravity takes care of that. So now with this swung down out of the way, now we can start to address some of the bolts underneath the column here. Okay, that's better. Now I got both hands free. I went ahead and I took the whole vent out because it just unclips the same way from the other side. You don't have to do that. I'm doing it for the sake of being able to video this. So underneath there's a flap. It's part of the insulation that goes on the firewall that's going to cover the bolts that you need to get to. And it's one of these metal stupid push discs up here. Oh, washers. Now this one I want to try to save, and what you can do, especially since you got room to, and they grip the threads, a lot of times you can just end up turning this thing just like a screw, and if you apply a little pressure pulling back on it as you do that, it'll actually, I can feel it starting to move now, it'll actually unscrew right off of the threads. There it is. So you can see there's little teeth on it that grip onto the threads of the stud. And with this one, if you grab it with a needle nose and you just kind of rotate it and pull, you can get the whole thing off. So I wanted to save this because I just wanted to push it back on. It's easier. So that's off. And then now we can pull this portion of insulation for the firewall out of the way, and that reveals all of the bolts. One of them is a stud, so you'll need a deep socket for that one. They're all 10mm. So before we loosen those bolts on the firewall, we're going to drop the column down because there's a lot of wiring that's going to stay. That's part of the dash wiring harness that we need to disconnect from the column. And the easiest way to do it is if we can drop it down, and then that way it gives you a little more access up here. Make sure everything is disconnected so when you go to yank it out you don't accidentally damage a wire in here. So it's 2 15mm nuts up here. There it is. Alright, now because we still have it loose down there, I've got a little bit of control here. So it's not going to come down too far. You don't want to take any chances. Anyway, so now it gives me access a little bit more to the wiring here, and I can see what needs to be disconnected, what can stay. All these wires that go up through the column, those can stay on because that's just part of the column's wiring harness. But these wires on the other side need to be disconnected because they have to stay with the dash. So I'm going to go ahead and disconnect all that and I'll be back. So the connectors on the bottom that I could get to, one for the column, this one, a couple of them, I was able to get those loose, but there's like 2 big connectors on the top that are kind of in a tight spot. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this one bolt in and loose, and then I'm going to take the other 3 out, and then what I'll do is see if I can't get the column to droop down more for me. This swivel, there we go. Alright, so I'm going to leave that one loose, and I'm going to take the other 3 out. And that, I believe, is going to give me some more room. And again, you're right underneath this thing. So as these bolts come out, I'm bracing the steering column with my shoulder so this thing doesn't fly down on me. Now it's just a matter of getting these bolts loose. So with those two 15 millimeter loose, I put the nut back in one to hold it up here, and this whole brace underneath that cradles the bottom of the column, because of the ears, you're not going to be able to get that thing out with it connected to the column. So it's 4 13 millimeter bolts that go around it. We're going to take those loose, and then we're going to take this whole brace off. And then with this brace out of the way, the column is going to be able to drop down nice and easy without those ears being in the way to mess anything up. So now we can take this loose, and then we'll worry about the electrical connections and getting the firewall bolts out. Alright, that worked perfect. So with the two top bolts in the firewall taken out and the two bottom ones loosened, I was able to pull the column way down. And actually I have it propped on a box to keep it from going any further. And now I can get to these connections on the top of the column that just was almost impossible to do without having it down farther than this. You could probably almost completely disconnect it and just have it lay on the floor, or if you still have your seats in, you could lay the steering wheel on the seat and then just kind of lay the end of the steering column on the floor and then take all this loose. I think there's enough slack in the wiring to do that. So anyway, so I'm going to get in here and get these connections loose, and then the column should just come right out. Okay, so I think that is all the electrical connectors that go to the column are loose. But there's a huge jumble of wires in there, so I may have missed one. So when I pull the column down, I'm just going to be a little bit careful, check the wiring, and hopefully everything is done and this thing will come right out of the car. 2 bolts to go. There it is, completely out. Some people take the steering wheel off. I like to leave it on, use a towel. There it is. So now I can look at it, I can mess with it. If you're taking it out to repair it, it has a way to stand up so you can mess with it. Or you can put the bracket back on and then bolt it up in a vise, take the steering wheel off, do what you have to. But I like storing it like this. Here's also another good tip. If this is a long-term project, bag and tag. All right, there's nothing worse than looking through a box of bolts and thinking, is that the one that went to that? I don't know. So now I know, because everything is in one bag together, because it might be out for a little bit before it goes back in. So I want to make sure I keep all that stuff together. Anyway, that's it for now. 3 components out. Now it's dash and AC box.